The year was 1867, and the desert night carried the kind of silence that weighed heavier than gunfire. John Callahan sat slouched at his kitchen table, the last half-inch of whiskey rocking in its bottle with every shift of his elbow. The boards of the house groaned in the wind, a sound he had grown used to, like bones settling in a coffin. His ranch had once been a place of noise, hammer strikes, cattle lowing, his wife humming while she kneaded bread. Now it was a shell. The cattle were gone, driven off by thieves or hunger, the barn sagged with a broken spine, and his wife lay 6 months cold in the ground behind the cottonwoods. The desert wind scratched at the shutters, and John's head dropped into his hand. He was thinking of nothing and everything, the way a man does when he has run out of both hope and coin. He had just reached for the bottle again when it came, the knock. It wasn't the kind of polite tap you'd hear from a neighbor borrowing flour. It was firm, demanding, out of place in the midnight hush. John stiffened, every hair on his neck lifting. No one came to his door this late, not unless it was trouble. He rose slow, the chair leg scraping. His rifle leaned against the wall near the door, and he caught it up before unlatching a lock. The wood groaned as he pulled the door open. 2 figures stood on the porch, still as carved stone. At first, he thought his drink had turned to hallucination, but the figures didn't waver. They were women, young, not girls, but not yet with the lines of age. Both wore deerskin dresses stitched with patterns he didn't recognize, and necklaces of bone and turquoise glinted in the moonlight. Their long black hair hung loose down their backs, eyes fixed straight on him. Dark, unblinking, unafraid. Apache! John's heart kicked. Every instinct screamed to slam the door and bar it. He had fought Apaches years ago, skirmishes where men vanished into arroyos and never came out. He had buried friends whose scalps were taken clean from their heads. But these 2 weren't painted for war. They had come without rifles, only knives at their belts. The taller one spoke first, her voice calm, certain, though her English carried the rough edge of translation. "You are Callahan." John didn't answer. His finger curled around the trigger of his rifle. "We need you," the second said, softer, but just as steady. "Get off my land." His voice cracked from disuse, the whiskey rasp roughening it further. The taller one didn't flinch. She stepped closer into the pale wash of moonlight, and for the first time he saw the glint of desperation in her eyes, though it was buried beneath a wall of pride. "Our brother is hurt," she said. "He will die if no one helps." John stared, his jaw tight. "Then you should find a doctor. There's one in Bisbee." "No doctor," the younger sister said, quickly. "You." The words hit him like a fist. He laughed, short, bitter. "Me? I'm no healer." "You know," the taller said. That stopped him cold. The rifle sagged a little in his hands. He swallowed, unsure whether they were bluffing, whether they had mistaken him for someone else. "I don't know what you think you heard about me, but you got the wrong man," he muttered. They exchanged a look, speaking in their tongue, quick and sharp. He couldn't catch more than fragments, but the urgency was plain. When the taller one turned back to him, she spoke slower, with weight behind every word. "You will come. Now." The audacity of it sparked a flare of anger in John's gut. "I don't take orders in my own house. You think you can just walk up here in the dead of night, knock on my door, and drag me off to what? Some canyon where your brother lies? Maybe this is a trick. Maybe you brought me out here so your men could slit my throat." Her chin lifted. "If we wanted your blood, it would already be on the dirt." The younger sister's eyes flicked to the ground, and John thought he saw something softer there, something close to fear, but it was not for him. It was for whoever lay bleeding out in the desert. John's chest tightened, though he pushed it down with a hard swallow of whiskey bitterness. He remembered too well the fever that had taken Mary, the way he had sat by her bed, helpless, powerless, praying for someone, anyone, to knock on the door and offer aid. No one had. Not then. Still, fear gnawed at him. To be caught harboring Apaches was to invite a noose from his neighbors or a bullet from passing riders. The war between settlers and tribes was a fire still smoldering, and any white man siding with the other side was bound to be branded a traitor. "I can't help you," he said, and pushed at the door. The younger sister stepped forward, planting her hand against the frame. Her eyes locked on his, not pleading but fierce. "If he dies, his blood is on you." The weight of the words pressed into him like a stone on his chest. His hand trembled on the rifle. He tried to look away, but the fire in her gaze held him still. Minutes stretched like hours. The only sound was the wind and the dry creak of the porch boards beneath their boots. Finally, John let out a curse and shoved the rifle aside. "Damn you both," he muttered. "Where is he?" The taller sister nodded once. They turned without another word, moving into the desert night. John grabbed his coat, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and followed. The moon lit the way, silver light spilling across the cactus and rocks. Shadows moved with them, stretching long and thin. John's boots crunched on gravel while the sisters moved near silent, gliding over the ground as though they were part of it. The silence pressed in heavy, broken only by the distant yip of a coyote. He couldn't shake the suspicion that he was being led to his death. Every turn in the trail seemed like it might end with an arrow from the dark. He glanced off and behind, but saw only the endless night. "How far?" he muttered. "Close," the taller answered. They led him into a narrow wash, where the air grew cooler, the ground damp with hidden springs. The walls of rock rose on either side, crowding the sky into a narrow strip of stars. He felt penned in, a lamb walking to slaughter. Then he saw the fire. It burned small, hidden from view, until they turned a final bend. Beside it lay a man stretched on a blanket of hides. He was younger than John expected, perhaps 25, with shoulders broad but face gaunt from blood loss. His chest rose shallow, each breath rattling like dry leaves. Dark stains covered his shirt, and the air smelled sharp with iron. The sisters knelt quickly at his side, murmuring to him in Apache. His eyes fluttered open, fever-bright, and he gave a weak groan. John stood at the edge of the firelight, his hands stiff at his sides. This was the choice. He could turn back now, leave them to their fate, return to his empty ranch and empty bottle. Or he could step forward and try, though he had no idea what good his hands could do. The taller sister looked up, her gaze piercing him across the flames. "You will help him." John's mouth was dry. His stomach turned with a familiar, bitter helplessness, the same that had consumed him as Mary slipped away night after night until her body went still. He had failed her. He couldn't bear to fail again. His boots scraped the gravel as he stepped closer to the wounded man. The sisters made room, watching with eyes that bore into his soul. John knelt, pressing 2 fingers to the Apache's neck. The pulse was weak, fluttering like a trapped bird. His shirt was soaked through, the wound ragged along his side, half-rotted from days without proper care. John reached for the whiskey flask at his belt, unscrewed the cap, and poured the fire burn down over the wound. The young man arched and cried out. The sisters grabbed his arms, holding him still. John tore strips from his own shirt, pressing them against the bleeding flesh. "Don't die on me, boy," he muttered through clenched teeth. "I've seen enough graves." The sisters chanted in their tongue, low and steady, while John worked with the desperate clumsiness of a man who had nothing but his will. His hands shook, his breath rasped. Sweat beaded on his brow despite the chill. Minutes dragged into hours. The fire sank low, shadows dancing on the canyon walls. The wounded man's breathing grew fainter. John pressed harder, whispered curses, and poured more whiskey, hoping it was enough. At last, the bleeding slowed. The man lay still, face pale, chest rising shallow but steady. For the moment, just the moment, he lived. John sagged back, wiping his brow with a filthy sleeve. The sisters' eyes were on him, still, unreadable. Gratitude? Suspicion? He couldn't tell. He met their gaze and saw, for the first time, the flicker of something fragile in their expressions, hope. And that was when the truth hit him hard. What they wanted from him was not a simple favor. It was a burden heavy enough to crush what little life remained in him. The night wind whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of smoke and blood. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled. John felt the weight of the desert pressing down, and in the silence that followed, He knew one thing with brutal certainty. Whatever path he had just stepped onto, there was no turning back. The fire burned low in the canyon, little more than red embers gnawing at the darkness. John sat with his back to a boulder, his rifle balanced across his knees. The sisters crouched close to their brother, whispering in Apache, their voices rising and falling in tones like wind through dry grass. Every so often, the wounded man stirred, his lips moving in fever, but the words came broken and swallowed by pain. John's eyes kept roaming the rim of rock above them. The desert didn't forgive fools, and here he was, huddled in a canyon with 3 Apaches, 1 half dead, and the night stretched wide enough to swallow them all. Any rider could pass by and see the glow of fire, and then there'd be no explaining himself when bullets came raining down. He told himself to get up and leave, but his boots stayed planted. The taller sister finally broke the silence. "He breathes easier," she said. John glanced at the man, the bandages already dark with seeped blood. "For now, he's still in bad shape. Might not make it through the night." The younger sister's head lifted quick, her eyes sharp as flint. "He will live." John shook his head. "You can't just will it so. Sometimes a man's body gives out, and there's no fighting it." He paused, bitterness in his throat. "I know that better than most." The sisters said nothing. They didn't ask about the grief that clung to him like dust, and he was glad of it. Words were wasted on the dead. He tried to close his eyes, but sleep never came. Instead, he watched the stars roll slow across the sky, 1,000 cold eyes staring down. He thought of Mary, how her last breath had been softer than falling ash, and how the world hadn't changed a damn bit since. Maybe that was why he hadn't sent the sisters away. Maybe he saw in their desperation the same helplessness he'd carried alone. By dawn, the wounded man still clung to life. His face was pale, sweat beating at his temples, but his chest rose steady. John checked the bandages, replaced them with strips torn from his coat, and poured another swallow of whiskey over the wound. The man groaned, but the sisters held him firm until he stilled again. "He must not stay here," the taller sister said. "Too open. Too easy to find." John frowned. "You expect to move him? He can't even stand." "We carry him." "And where?" "There's no town that'll take you in, not with him wearing Apache colors." Her eyes met his unyielding. "There is a place." John wanted to ask where, but he bit the question back. He wasn't part of their world, and maybe he didn't want to be. Yet, when the sisters lifted their brother with ropes and hides, straining under his weight, he found himself stooping to take hold of one end. They set out while the sun was still low, shadows stretching long across the desert floor. The ground baked underfoot, cracked and harsh, the air filled with the smell of dust and creosote. The burden of the wounded man slowed them. Each step measured, sweat rolling in sheets down their necks. Hours dragged, and the sun climbed merciless, a white fire in the sky. John's back screamed with pain, but he didn't loosen his grip. The sisters moved with tireless determination, as though the desert itself had carved its endurance into their bones. By mid-morning, the sound reached them, distant at first, then clearer. Horses, more than one. The steady drum of hooves carried across the dry basin. The sisters froze, crouching low. John lowered the wounded man gently to the ground and reached for his rifle. Dust plumed on the horizon, rising from a line of riders. "They hunt," the younger sister whispered. John swore under his breath. "For us, for any," the taller answered. "But they find us, they kill us." The riders were still a ways off, but closing. John's mind raced. A white rancher traveling with Apaches, it would be no question in the hunters' minds. He'd be strung up same as them. "Move," he hissed. They hoisted the brother again, stumbling toward a dry ravine that cut across the plain. They slipped into its shadow, scrambling over rock and brush, the wounded man groaning with every jolt. The sound of hooves grew louder, closer, until John could hear the creak of saddle leather and the jangle of spurs. The hunters rode past the ravine, 6 men, rifles resting across their saddles. John's breath caught in his throat. The riders slowed, scanning the land, their eyes sharp as hawks. For a long moment, it seemed they would turn straight toward the ravine. Then a shout went up, pointing toward the far hills, and the group spurred their horses that way. Dust swallowed them as they thundered off. The sisters exhaled as one, shoulders sagging. John leaned back against the rock, his pulse hammering. He'd been a hair from death, and he knew it. They moved again once the hunters vanished. This time John kept his rifle ready, eyes sweeping every ridge. The desert felt alive with threats, each shadow waiting to strike. By midday, they found a narrow canyon split, hidden by mesquite and scrub. Here, the sisters laid their brother down beneath a jutting overhang, shaded from the worst of the sun. They fetched water from a seep trickling down the stone, wetting cloths to cool his brow. John took the chance to sit, his muscles screaming from the burden of the carry. He drank deep from his canteen, the water warm but precious. "You could have left," the taller sister said, not looking at him. "Could have," John admitted. "Why stay?" He thought of Mary again, how he had begged neighbors for help, how none had come. He thought of the emptiness that had followed, and the hollow bottle that had become his only companion. "Because once I wish someone had stayed," he said at last. The younger sister studied him, her eyes softer now, though still wary. She said something in Apache to her sister, and they both nodded as if agreeing on a truth that had been waiting for them. They built a small fire that night, careful to shield the glow with rocks. John cleaned the wound again, working with slow patience. The young man stirred, eyes fluttering open long enough to meet John's. There was no gratitude there, only the grim acknowledgement of two men tied to life by a fraying thread. The sisters sang softly in their tongue, a melody low and haunting. John didn't know the words, but the sound wrapped around the night, like a prayer. For a moment he felt the ache in his chest ease, the ghosts quiet. The peace didn't last. Sometime past midnight, a sharp crack echoed across the canyon, rifle fire. John snapped awake, hand clutching his weapon. The sisters were already on their feet, knives drawn, eyes wide. Another shot rang, closer this time. Then the sound of voices, men calling to each other in English. "They found us," John whispered. Panic surged. The canyon walls gave no escape but the way they'd come. He looked at the wounded man, too weak to move, and knew the choice before him. The sister's eyes locked on his, fierce, demanding. "You fight," the taller said. John nodded, heart hammering. He crawled to the edge of the canyon mouth, laying the rifle across a stone. Shadows moved in the dark, torchlight flickering. He counted at least 4 men. Hunters, maybe the same riders as before, tracking their trail with ruthless patience. The first torchbearer stepped into view. John didn't think, he fired. The crack split the night, the man fell, and chaos erupted. Shouts rang out, bullets whined off rock, sparks spraying where lead struck stone. The sisters moved swift, darting along the rocks, arrows hissing into the dark. One man cried out, another cursed. John reloaded with shaking hands. Fired again, the kick slamming into his shoulder. The hunters returned fire, shots ricocheting, dust stinging his face. The air filled with smoke and screams. John's blood surged, his world narrowing to the rifle's sights, the flash of torchlight, the thunder of gunfire. He thought of Mary, of the graves, of the silence that had swallowed him whole. And he fired again, because if he didn't, they would all be corpses by dawn. When the echoes faded, the canyon fell still. 2 men lay sprawled in the dust, torches guttering beside them. The rest had fled, their shouts fading into the night. John lowered the rifle, his breath ragged. His ears rang, his hands shook, but he was alive. So were the sisters. So was their brother, still breathing shallow, untouched by the storm of bullets. The younger sister approached him, her face lit by the dying torch. For the first time, her gaze held something more than fire. It held respect. "You fight with us," she said. John managed a hollow laugh. "Seems I did." The taller sister nodded. "You are part of this now." The words sank deep, heavier than the rifle in his hands. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The hunters would return, more of them, angrier, to every settler in these parts, he'd be branded an ally of the enemy. He sat down hard against the rock, staring at the wounded man, at the sisters who watched him with unwavering eyes. His chest rose and fell in the hush that followed, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down. The desert had taken everything from him. Now it had given him a choice, and choices out here were more dangerous than bullets. The sisters returned to their brother's side, murmuring in their tongue. John leaned his head back against the stone, the stars cold and unblinking above. He had thought himself finished, a man already buried in spirit. But tonight he had spilled blood, not for his land, not for revenge, but for them. And that truth shook him more than any gunfight ever could. The silence deepened. Somewhere out in the night, a coyote called, its cry long and lonely. John listened, knowing it echoed his own heart. And as the last torch died to embers, he realized the desert was not finished with him yet. Dawn crept into the canyon like a thief, spilling pale light across the jagged stone. John had not slept. His rifle lay across his knees, his eyes fixed on the mouth of the gorge where shadows still clung. The sisters dozed in turns beside their brother, keeping him alive with water sipped from cupped hands and cloth pressed to his brow. The world felt too still, too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before men arrive with loaded guns and hard eyes. John pushed himself to his feet, bones stiff, and climbed the rock slope until he could see out across the desert. The land stretched endless, ridges of red stone, flats of sand baked white, distant scrub etched against the horizon. Nothing moved. Not yet, but his gut twisted like barbed wire, warning him the peace wouldn't last. He had crossed the line. He'd fought alongside the sisters, shot white men dead, to settlers that made him worse than an outlaw. And once word spread, there would be no sanctuary, not even in the loneliest saloon. He descended to find the younger sister awake, watching him with those dark eyes that never seemed to blink. "You fear," she said. "I'd be a fool not to," John answered. "You stay. You fight. That is not fear." John shook his head. "Fear's still there. Always is. Courage is just moving anyway." She studied him, as if weighing those words, then turned back to her brother. He stirred, groaned his breath, rattling. The wound festered despite John's efforts, angry red streaks crawling out from the bandage. Time was running short. The taller sister rose, dusting sand from her skirt. "We must reach the stronghold. Our people wait. There he can heal." "And where's that?" John asked. She pointed east, toward a line of broken cliffs in the far distance. Beyond those ridges. John measured the distance with a glance. 2 days' travel, maybe more, through country watched by hunters and militias. He almost said it was impossible. But the way she stood, unyielding as stone, silenced the thought. "We can try," he said instead. They built a litter from mesquite branches bound with rawhide strips, laid the wounded man across it, and lashed the ends so two could carry at a time. It was slow, punishing work, each step sinking into sand, each hill climb stealing breath from their lungs. Heat bore down, cruel and merciless, the sun a coin of fire overhead. By midday, John's shirt clung to him in sweat-soaked tatters. His shoulders ached, his mouth tasted of iron. Yet he carried, because to stop was to let the man die. That afternoon they reached a dry riverbed choked with willows. Here they rested in the shade, feeding the warrior thin broth boiled from rabbit John had shot earlier. The sisters sang to him again, their voices weaving strange comfort into the air. For a fleeting moment John let himself believe they might succeed. But fate out here was never so kind. Hooves thundered before he even saw them. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised. Dust rose at the river's bend. 5 riders, hard men with rifles and revolvers, their faces set in the grim mask of hunters who smelled quarry close. "Down!" John barked. The sisters dragged their brother behind the willows, crouching low. John dropped to one knee, sights leveled. The riders spotted the smoke of their small fire. One pointed, shouted. The group veered toward them at a gallop. John fired. The lead rider toppled from his saddle, horse screaming as it stumbled over him. The rest scattered, guns flashing. Bullets whined, would splintered around John's head. He rolled, fired again, caught another in the shoulder. The man spun and fell. The sisters moved like shadows. The younger loosed an arrow that buried itself in a rider's chest. He toppled, wheezing as his horse bolted. The taller darted forward, knife gleaming, slashing the leg of another as he tried to dismount. He screamed, lost balance, crashed to the sand. The last rider wheeled his horse hard, spurted away, dust trailing. Retreating, but not for long. He'd bring more. The air rang with echoes of gunfire. John's chest heaved, the acrid taste of powder coating his tongue. Around them, 3 men lay dead or dying, the willows painted with blood. The sisters moved quickly, stripping weapons, tossing bodies aside. No hesitation, no remorse. Survival left no room for either. John stared at his hands, black with powder, sticky with blood not his own. Once, years ago, he'd sworn never to fight again. He'd promised Mary he was done with violence. Yet here he was, killing alongside those the world told him were enemies. The younger sister touched his arm, grounding him. You saved us again. He looked at her, saw the dust streaked across her face, the raw determination in her eyes, and felt something stir in him, a flicker of purpose he thought long dead. They moved on before more hunters could arrive. The journey grew harsher with each mile. They crossed open flats where the sun beat them senseless, climbed ragged slopes where each stone shifted treacherous underfoot, and waded through thorny gullies that tore at their legs. The wounded man drifted in and out of consciousness, his fever rising, his breaths ragged. That night they camped beneath the cliffs, no fire this time. John sat awake, rifle across his lap, while the sisters whispered together in their tongue. He caught only fragments, but sensed the weight of their words, plans, fears, hopes tied to a brother's fragile life. At last, the taller sister approached him. She crouched close, her gaze steady in the dark. Do you know why we chose you? John shook his head. Been wondering that since you knocked on my door. Our father told us, she said. Many years ago, when we were children, he met a white man, a rancher. That man spared our cousin when others would have killed him. He said, there is one among them who remembers mercy. Her words struck him like a hammer. Memories rose, unbidden. An ambush on the San Pedro River, a young Apache boy caught in the chaos, his knife trembling. John had lowered his gun that day, turned his back, let the boy run. He had almost forgotten. Almost. That was you, she said. So we came. John's throat tightened. He had lived so long believing himself a failure, a man hollowed out by loss. Yet to them, he was something else, a memory of mercy carried across years. He looked at the sisters, their faces lit faint by starlight, and felt the ground shift beneath him. Perhaps he was not as lost as he thought. But dawn brought no mercy. The echo of hoofbeats rolled like thunder through the cliffs. John scrambled up the rocks and saw them. A line of riders sweeping across the flats, a dozen or more, dust clouds trailing. The survivor had kept his promise. They're coming, John called. The sisters lifted their brother, straining to move faster, but it was no use. The hunters closed swift, rifles flashing in the morning sun. Go! John barked. Get him to cover. He planted himself between the riders and the sisters, rifle braced. His heart slammed like a drum, fear clawing at him, but he held. The first volley cracked, bullets whining past. John fired back, dropping one from his saddle. Another shot split the air, grazing his arm, hot blood spilling down. He gritted his teeth, reloaded, fired again. The sisters joined him, arrows slicing the air. One rider fell, another veered off. Still they came, relentless. Dust and thunder, shouts and gunfire. The desert alive with death. A rider charged close, revolver blazing. John dropped to one knee, fired point-blank. The man pitched forward, horse rearing. John rolled clear, came up firing. Another fell. But there were too many. Bullets tore the ground, chipped stone from the cliffs. His rifle clicked empty. He reached for the revolver of a fallen hunter, firing wild, desperate. Then he heard the sisters cry. He spun to see the younger knocked down, a rider looming with knife raised. John's body moved before thought. He sprinted, slammed into the man, drove him back with raw fury. The knife slashed his shoulder, but he wrenched the revolver up and pulled the trigger. The blast threw the rider back in a cloud of dust. The sisters pulled him up, blood running down his arm, their brother still clutched tight between them. They fled into the maze of cliffs, hunters scattering behind. The chase raged through narrow gullies, bullets whining, dust choking the air. John staggered, every muscle aflame, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than survival. At last they reached a sheer wall where the cliff split. The sisters scrambled up a hidden path, dragging their brother. John turned, planting himself at the base, rifle in hand. The hunters closed, snarling curses. John fired until the rifle clicked empty, then swung it like a club, knocking one rider from his horse. He bellowed like a man possessed, each strike a defiance against the emptiness that had ruled him for years. When the last shot rang, silence fell. The surviving hunters broke, retreating into the dust, leaving their dead behind. John sank to his knees, chest heaving, blood soaking his sleeve. The sisters called down from the ridge, their faces fierce and shining with fire. He climbed, slow but steady, until he reached them. They looked at him long, saying nothing, but their eyes spoke volumes. Respect, gratitude, kinship forged in blood. At the ridge's crest, John saw it. A hidden valley beyond, green with cottonwoods, smoke rising from distant fires. The stronghold of their people. He stopped there, knowing his path ended at the edge. If he crossed, he would never return. If he stayed, he might yet find a place in the world he thought had cast him out. The sisters waited, their brother between them, alive because of him. John turned his face to the rising sun. For the first time in years, he felt the weight in his chest lift, replaced by something fierce and unyielding. Purpose. So, what do we take from this tale? The voice of the land seemed to whisper. That a man is not bound by the losses he carries. That mercy once given can return years later in the shape of strangers at your door. He watched as the sisters disappeared into the valley, their figures swallowed by the morning light. He stood alone on the ridge, battered but unbroken, and let the silence of the desert settle around him. And if you're listening now, take this with you. The frontier wasn't just a place. It was a crucible. It burned away lies, left only truth. And the truth is this: sometimes the ones we least expect arrive at our door, and they change everything. If this story struck you, share it. Tell it again, because the frontier holds many such tales, and this was only one.